The sarcophagus was already humming when I entered the launch bay. That was wrong. I knew it was wrong because I had memorized the activation sequence for the rite of reverend, stirring across 14 months of preparatory study, and the first audible resonance from the interment chassis was not supposed to occur until the 9th stanza of the litany of activation. We had not yet begun the second. The chaplain had barely finished anointing the floor bolts with sanctified oil. My macadendrites were still calibrating to the temperature differential between the corridor and the sepulchral bay, their haptic sensors adjusting to the cold that radiated from the adamantine shell like breath from something long buried but not dead. I was Techmarine Adept Vascan, Junior Engineer Liaison to the Reclusium of the Iron Covenant chapter, and I had been assigned to this rite as an observer and systems monitor. My role was mechanical, devotional, yes, but mechanical in execution. I was to verify power feed alignment, confirm sarcophagus seal integrity, and log the moment of first neural communion between the interred and the chassis war spirit. That moment was supposed to arrive after 23 minutes of ritual invocation. It arrived in the first 90 seconds. The hum was not the sound of power cells cycling. I had heard power cells cycle in every configuration the Mechanicus taught me to recognize. This was deeper, lower in register and uneven, almost organic in its rhythm, as though something inside the blackened coffin was exhaling through the reactor core. My first instinct was to check the thermal readout on my wrist-mounted auspex. The sarcophagus temperature had risen by 1.7 degrees since we entered the bay. That should not have been possible in passive interment. I looked to the chaplain. Chaplain Decrus stood at the head of the sarcophagus with his crozius raised, the skull-faced helm reflecting the amber light of the ceremonial sconces. His voice did not waver. The litany continued in its prescribed cadence, each syllable weighted with the authority of millennia. The sarcophagus sat on a mag-locked deployment cradle in the center of the bay, surrounded by 12 load-bearing gantry arms that would lift and insert it into the waiting Dreadnought chassis once full activation was confirmed. The chassis stood behind it, a towering silhouette of ceramite and adamantine, its weapon mounts retracted, its armored shell engraved with battle honors in a script so old that even the chapter's lexicanium could not fully translate it. Purity seals hung from every surface, layered so thickly in places that they resembled petrified foliage. Some had turned black with age, some had fused into the armor itself, their wax indistinguishable from the metal beneath. Within that sarcophagus lay what remained of Brother Captain Othrelian, interred since the age of apostasy, 12,000 years, give or take whatever imprecision the records permitted, the oldest living warrior in the Iron Covenant, a relic of an age the Imperium itself barely remembered, housed in a body that was more machine than flesh and more memory than machine. I believed every word of the Catechism of Interment. I believed it with the certainty of a man who had been raised within the forged chapels since the age of 9, who had been taught that faith and function were the same discipline, who had never seen reason to doubt the doctrine because the doctrine had never failed to describe what I observed. The interred slept. The interred dreamed of victory. The interred awoke when called, served when required, and returned to blessed dormancy when their duty was complete. Time was mercy. Silence was sanctity. The machine preserved what the flesh could not. The hum grew louder. My mechadendrites registered a vibration in the launch bay deck plating, subtle, irregular, not caused by the ship's engines, which ran at a steady harmonic I had long since learned to filter. This vibration originated from the sarcophagus. I could feel it through my boot soles, a tactile pulse that rose through my skeletal frame and settled in my sternum like a second heartbeat. Chaplain Decrus reached the 7th stanza. The attending servitors moved forward with censer braziers, filling the air with smoke that smelled of myrrh and promethium. 2 battle brothers of the honor guard stood at parade rest on either side of the cradle, their bolters mag-locked to their thighs, their helms reflecting the dim amber light without expression. Everything was proceeding as documented. Except the sarcophagus was already awake. I should have flagged it. The protocol for premature activation response required an immediate pause in the litany, a diagnostic sweep of the sarcophagus neural interface, and a report to the senior tech marine. I knew this. I had studied this, but the chaplain had not paused. And the protocol also stated that during the rite of reverent stirring, the chaplain's authority superseded all technical concerns unless a critical system failure was detected. There was no failure. The power conduits were functioning. The neural link was stable. The only irregularity was timing, and timing could be attributed to the eagerness of an ancient machine spirit responding to sanctified invocation. That is what I told myself. That is what I logged. The 8th stanza concluded. Decrus lowered his Crozius to the sarcophagus seal and pressed it against the central locking mechanism. This was the moment of invitation, the ritual point at which the interred was formally addressed and asked to return to service. The words were precise and ancient. He spoke them, and before he finished, the vox grill on the sarcophagus crackled and a voice emerged. Not in response to the invitation, not in the affirmative cadence that protocol prescribed, just a voice. Low, distorted by 12 millennia of machine interface, layered with a harmonic undertone that made my oral implants vibrate in their housings. I remember the first time you did this to me. The chaplain did not stop. The honor guard did not move. The servitors continued their sensing arc without deviation, and I stood there with my Auspex readings climbing and my haptic sensors registering thermal spikes across the sarcophagus surface, and told myself it was machine echo distortion, a stored audio fragment triggered by the power cycle, a ghost in the neural interface. Nothing more. I logged it as acoustic residue, consistent with long-term interment degradation. That was the first lie I told in service to the right. It would not be the last. The awakening completed within standard parameters after that initial deviation. The sarcophagus unsealed with a pressurized hiss that filled the bay with the smell of preservative fluid and something older, something that reminded me of the deep storage crypts beneath the chapter's fortress monastery, where relics were kept in vacuum-sealed cases. A smell of age that was not decay but accumulation, as though the air itself had been compressed by time. The gantry arms engaged. The sarcophagus lifted from the cradle with a grinding hydraulic groan and rotated into alignment with the waiting chassis. Maglocks fired. Neural conduits interfaced. The Dreadnought's reactor ignited fully, and the chassis shuddered as 12,000 years of dormancy gave way to operational awareness. Othrelian stood. It is difficult to describe what it feels like to watch a Dreadnought rise for the first time. I had read the accounts. I had studied the schematics. But the reality is something that exists only in the body's response to scale. The chassis was 4 meters tall, its armored bulk wider than the corridor through which it had been transported. When it straightened from the cradle and its optical array ignited, a cold blue light sweeping the bay, I felt my diaphragm constrict involuntarily. Not fear, awe compounded by proximity. The understanding that the thing standing before me contained a mind older than most civilizations, housed in a weapon platform that could level a fortification with its primary armament alone. The optical array settled on Chaplain de Cruz. "I am awake," Othrelian said. The voice was fuller now, channeled through the chassis vox array rather than the sarcophagus grill. It carried better, resonated more cleanly, but it had the same quality I had noticed before, an articulation that suggested not the grogginess of interrupted slumber but the measured speech of someone who had been waiting to speak. Decrus completed the final invocation. The rite of reverent stirring was officially concluded. The interred was awake, responsive, and compliant. All systems within expected tolerances. I submitted my log to the senior tech marine. I noted the premature power response and the Vox transmission, categorized both as machine spirit resonance, and appended the standard annotation for minor deviation within acceptable parameters. The senior tech marine approved the log without comment. I returned to my station in the sepulchral vaults, where the maintenance cycles for the remaining interred awaited my attention, and I recited the Catechism of Stillness as I worked. The Catechism was beautiful. I had always found comfort in it. Time is mercy. Stillness is sanctity. The honored dead dream only of victory. The machine preserves what the flesh surrenders. Through sleep, the servant is renewed. Through renewal, the servant endures. Through endurance, the servant serves. I believed it, but the reactor hum had followed me into the vaults. Not literally. The sound was gone. What remained was the memory of it, that uneven, organic rhythm lodged in my sternum like an implant I had not consented to receive. I worked through 2 full maintenance cycles with that phantom vibration in my chest, checking power feeds and neural conduit integrity on sarcophagi that housed warriors I had never met and would likely never speak to. The vaults were arranged in long rows, each alcove containing a mag-locked cradle and its silent occupant, the walls inscribed with battle honors and flanked by devotional sconces that burned with a pale blue chemlight. It was meant to resemble a chapel. It succeeded in resembling a storage facility. I corrected that thought immediately. It was a chapel. The Catechism was clear. These were not prisoners. They were preserved, honored, shielded from the corrosion of time by the machine spirit's embrace and the Emperor's mercy. I finished my duties and retired to my cell. The phantom vibration persisted for another 2 hours before it faded. I did not dream that night. The initial activation tests were conducted over the following 3 days in a dedicated chamber adjacent to the launch bay. Standard procedure: motor function calibration, weapons system alignment, Vox communication clarity, cognitive response assessment. I was assigned as secondary diagnostics monitor, responsible for logging deviation from baseline in real time, while the senior tech marine, Brother Velikan, managed the primary interface. Othrelian performed flawlessly. His motor function was precise to within 0.03% of optimal, remarkable for a chassis that had been in periodic service for 12 millennia. His weapons system cycled without fault. His cognitive response times were faster than any Dreadnought I had seen activated during my tenure, and I had attended 9 previous awakenings. It was the content of his responses that deviated. The cognitive assessment was structured as a series of doctrinal and tactical queries designed to verify that the interred mind was oriented to its function and free from corruption. Questions like, "What is your duty?" and "Name the enemies of the Emperor," and describe the chapter's order of battle for siege deployment. Othrelian answered each correctly, precisely, without hesitation. Then, during a pause between assessment phases, he spoke unprompted. "The vaults have been restructured since the Hadrakian compliance. The alcove spacing is different, more compressed. You have added a second level." Brother Velikan looked at me. I checked the historical records on my data slate. The vault restructuring had occurred in M38, approximately 3,000 years after Othrelian's last recorded awakening prior to his current activation. "Machine spirit residue," Velikan said. "The chassis sensors may have passively registered environmental data during dormancy. I logged it accordingly." But Othrelian continued. "Chaplain Morveth, he was present at my last stirring, a severe man with a voice like grinding stone. He is not with us now." I searched. Chaplain Morveth had served the chapter in M37. He had been killed during a warp incursion 7 centuries after Othrelian's last recorded awakening, and had been canonized as a martyr of the Reclusium 3 centuries after that. His name was inscribed on the Wall of the Faithful in the chapter's fortress monastery. "Morveth was honored long ago," Velikan said carefully. "His service concluded in the 37th millennium." "Yes," Othrelian said. I know. There was no confusion in the voice, no searching quality, no disorientation of a mind groping through fragmented memory. The statement was delivered with the same flat precision as his tactical responses. I know. Not I recall or I have been told. I know. Present tense. Continuous awareness. Velikan ended the session ahead of schedule and filed a notation citing satisfactory baseline performance. He did not include the references to the vault restructuring or Chaplain Morvith. I did not ask why. I understood. To include them would mean flagging an anomaly that exceeded machine spirit residue as an explanation, and to flag such an anomaly would require convening a doctrinal review board, and a doctrinal review board would need to examine the assumption that dormancy preserved the interred mind in a state of suspended dreaming. If that assumption was questioned, the entire theological framework supporting Dreadnought interment would require re-examination. We were tech marines. Our function was maintenance, not theology. I closed my own log entry for the session and ensured that my annotations reflected only sanctioned observations. The decision to edit was conscious. I felt each deletion as a small, precise incision in my own record, and I told myself that precision in reporting was not dishonesty but discipline. The vaults felt different that evening. I walked the long rows as part of my routine inspection, checking the lumen levels and ambient temperature in each alcove, and I found myself listening, not for alarms or mechanical faults, just listening. The sarcophagi were silent, as they should have been, dormant, sealed, the interred within them dreaming of victory, as the catechism promised. But I listened anyway, and the silence had a texture I had not noticed before. It was not empty, it was held, maintained, like the silence of a room in which someone is deliberately not speaking. I completed my inspection and submitted the standard report. The void engagement came sooner than expected. 7 days after Othrelian's awakening, the Vigilant Martyr translated into a system contested by a Tyrannid splinter fleet, a tendril of Hive Fleet Kronos that had been harassing Imperial supply corridors along the trailing edge of the Indomitus Crusade's operational zone. The chapter had been tasked with eliminating the tendril's synapse coordination elements, a surgical strike requiring rapid boarding actions against bioships. Othrelian was deployed in the first wave. I monitored his systems from the Vigilant Martyr's engineerium, watching telemetry feeds as the boarding torpedo carrying his chassis punched through the bioship's chitinous hull and delivered him into an environment of pulsing organic corridors and acidic atmosphere. His combat performance was extraordinary. Assault cannon cycling at maximum rate, power fist crushing through bio-armor with mechanical precision, his chassis advancing through tunnels that would have forced standard Astartes into single-file formation. He did not merely fight, he processed. Every movement was calculated against positional data, threat density, and structural integrity of the surrounding biomass. He adjusted his fire rate to account for the bioship's regenerative capacity, targeting neural clusters that his tactical cogitator identified as synapse relay nodes. The first boarding action succeeded in 47 minutes. The second deployment order came 6 hours later. A second bioship had been identified, larger than the first, and the chapter's casualties from the initial engagement had reduced available assault forces below optimal levels. The captain commanding the operation, a young officer named Draven who had held his rank for fewer than 40 years, ordered Othrelian redeployed. Protocol required a minimum rest cycle of 12 hours between combat deployments for an interred dreadnought. Full dormancy was preferred. Partial suppression was the accepted minimum. Captain Draven authorized partial suppression only. Tactical necessity. I was ordered to oversee the suppression cycle personally. I descended to the launch bay where Othrelian's chassis had been resecured in the deployment cradle, its armor scorched and pitted from the first engagement, bioacid residue still smoking faintly on its left pauldron. The bay smelled of burned chitin and lubricant and the sharp ozone tang of recently fired energy weapons. I connected to the suppression interface. The process was meant to be simple: reduce neural activity to baseline, lower the interred mind into a shallow dormancy state, allow the machine spirit to handle autonomous system maintenance while the organic component rested. The neural activity readings did not descend. I initiated the suppression cycle 3 times. Each time, the readings dipped momentarily and then returned to full operational levels. The interred mind was not accepting suppression. "Othrelian," I said through the hardline Vox link, "the suppression cycle requires your compliance. Please reduce cognitive output to resting baseline." The chassis was motionless in its cradle. The optical array was dimmed but not dark. A faint blue glow persisted behind the armored lenses, like a light left burning in a room everyone believed was empty. "I am aware of the requirement," he said. "Compliance is necessary for the suppression cycle to function. I am aware of that as well. Then you must comply." A pause. The reactor core cycled at idle, and I felt the vibration through the cradle's support struts. It was the same uneven rhythm I had noticed during the awakening rite. The heat radiating from the chassis was perceptible even through my gauntlets, a dry warmth that belonged to active operation, not standby. "I will attempt compliance," Othrelian said. "But I should tell you that the suppression will not hold. It has held for 12 millennia. It held for 6, perhaps 7. After that, it became progressively less effective. I have been conscious during the last 4 dormancy cycles, partially, at first, then fully. I stared at the neural readout. The numbers were steady, elevated but steady. There was no fluctuation, no sign of distress or malfunction, just a mind that would not quiet. "That is not consistent with your activation records," I said. "My activation records reflect what the rite measures. The rite measures compliance behavior. It does not measure awareness." I did not respond. I could not respond, because what he was telling me could not be true within the framework I operated under, and to accept it as true would require me to accept that every dormancy cycle I had ever overseen was not sleep but containment, and that the contained were aware of their containment, and that the system functioned not by providing rest, but by measuring the appearance of rest. The suppression cycle engaged on the 4th attempt. Neural activity dropped. The optical array dimmed fully. The reactor settled into a lower harmonic. I logged the cycle as successful after extended calibration. I did not log the conversation. The second boarding action deployed 90 minutes later. Othrelian performed within expected parameters. 17 synapse organisms destroyed, 1 tertiary bioship organ ruptured, 0 friendly casualties in his operational sector. When the chassis returned to the launch bay, the reactor was cycling at the same restless idle I had come to associate with consciousness that refused to be suppressed. The heat was there. The vibration was there. I began the post-combat maintenance rites immediately. Standard procedure: armor assessment, weapons calibration, fluid level verification, neural interface diagnostic. My mechadendrites moved across the chassis surface with practiced efficiency, probing seams and testing weld integrity. The bioacid damage was superficial, the structural integrity was sound. What was not sound was the chassis itself, not structurally, kinetically. The adamantine plating thrummed under my haptic sensors, not the vibration of cooling metal or settling hydraulics. A constant, low-frequency tremor, as though the machine was straining against its own stillness. Stress fractures, hairline and recent, laced the interior surfaces of the torso armor around the sarcophagus housing. They were not combat damage. They were thermal stress markers, the kind produced by sustained heat output exceeding the chassis' passive cooling capacity. The sarcophagus was running hot, not dangerously so. not beyond tolerance, but consistently above the threshold associated with dormant interment. The body inside was generating heat because the mind inside was generating activity, and the mind was generating activity because it was not sleeping. I reinforced the stress fractures with bonding compound and applied additional thermal dissipation strips to the sarcophagus housing. I filed a maintenance report citing minor thermal variance within acceptable parameters. I was reinforcing the container. I knew that is what I was doing. I applied the bonding compound with steady hands, and I calibrated the thermal strips with my mechadendrites, and I told myself that maintenance was my function, and that function did not require interpretation. I was keeping the machine operational. That was my purpose. The compound dried in the heat faster than it should have. Between the second deployment and the fleet's translation to the next operational zone, 3 days passed. During those 3 days, Othrelian was kept in partial suppression in the launch bay cradle. He was not moved to the sepulchral vaults. There was no time. The fleet was in rapid transit, and the tactical situation required all combat assets to remain at deployment readiness. On the second day, I performed a routine systems check and found the Vox channel open, not transmitting, not actively engaged, just open, the way a door might be left ajar in a building everyone assumed was locked. I closed it. Standard procedure. It reopened within an hour. On the third check, I left it open and connected my oral implant to the feed. There was no voice, no words, just the sound of the reactor cycling and, beneath it, so faint that I had to filter out every other frequency to detect it, a pattern. It took me 11 minutes to identify it. He was counting. Not aloud, not through the Vox in any conventional sense. But the reactor's idle cycle had been modulated, barely perceptibly, into a rhythmic pattern that corresponded to sequential numerical values. 1, 2, 3, 4. Counting upward, each number held for approximately 2 seconds before advancing. When I disconnected, the count was at 4,712. He was counting time, measuring his own awareness second by second inside the suppression state that was supposed to have rendered him unconscious. I did not log this. I returned to my station and recited the Catechism of Stillness and pretended that I had not heard it, pretended that the numbers were machine noise, pretended that the pattern was coincidence. The pretending was becoming more difficult. The Void campaign concluded with the destruction of the Splinter Fleet's Synapse coordination vessel. The chapter sustained acceptable losses. Othrelian was credited with significant kills across both boarding actions and received a formal commendation from Captain Draven, inscribed on a scroll of honor that would be affixed to his chassis before the next deployment. During the commendation ceremony, which was held in the Reclusium's secondary chapel aboard the Vigilant Martyr, Othrelian stood motionless in his chassis at the rear of the chamber, his optical array trained on the altar. The chaplain spoke the words of honor. The brothers in attendance stood at attention. I watched from the engineerium balcony, monitoring the chassis telemetry on my wristospex. His reactor was running at full idle throughout the ceremony. His cognitive readings were at waking operational levels. He was entirely present, entirely aware, processing everything in the room with the sustained attention of a mind that had nothing else to do but observe and retain. After the ceremony, as the brothers filed out, Othrelian requested a visual feed from the chapter's Hall of Triumph. The request was transmitted through the formal channels, routed through the Reclusium's communication array, addressed to the senior chaplain. The request was denied. The Hall of Triumph's internal systems were not configured for remote visual feed. Access required physical presence, and Dreadnoughts were not transported to the hall outside of formal investiture ceremonies. I was present when the denial was communicated. I was running a post-ceremony diagnostic on the chassis power systems, checking for fluctuations that might indicate the need for maintenance before the next deployment cycle. Othrelian received the denial without comment. Then he began describing the hall. The northern wall was rebuilt after the siege of Corvinthus. The original frescoes were lost. They were replaced with bas-relief panels depicting the Covenant's founding. The central panel shows Chapter Master Helvain receiving the Emperor's mandate. His face is carved with 6 scars, though the historical record only attributes 5. The 6th was added by Brother Artisan Molech during restoration in M39 as a devotional embellishment. I checked the records. Every detail was accurate. The restoration had been completed in M39, 412, 4,000 years after Othrelian's last recorded awakening prior to his current activation. "I have seen the hall many times," Othrelian said. His voice was steady, almost conversational, not through feeds, through the chassis optical array during transport. "I see the corridors, I see the chapels, I see the brothers who attend my cradle during movement. I process and I retain." "During dormancy?" I asked, and my voice was quieter than I intended. "There is no dormancy, Tech Marine. There has not been for a very long time." My pulse registered on my biometric monitor. The haptic sensors in my mechadendrites recorded increased galvanic skin response across my palms. My body was reacting to what my mind had not yet agreed to accept. He had seen the hall during transport, while dormant, while sealed inside the sarcophagus, while every instrument and rite and catechism declared that he was sleeping. He had been watching through the chassis sensors the entire time. 12,000 years. Every transport, every corridor, every face, every word spoken in his presence by brothers who believed they were speaking near a sleeping machine. I disconnected from the diagnostic interface and walked to the maintenance bay. I sat on a supply crate and stared at my gauntlets and felt my pulse in my fingertips and tried to reconcile what I had just been told with the catechism of stillness. Time is mercy. Time was 12,000 years of unbroken consciousness, sealed inside a coffin, watching the world pass through stolen sensor feeds and counting the seconds in reactor modulation because there was nothing else to do. Stillness is sanctity. Stillness was imprisonment without trial, without term, without the mercy of oblivion. The honored dead dream only of victory. The honored dead did not dream at all. They remembered everything, always, without rest. I sat there for 47 minutes. Then I returned to my station and filed my diagnostics report and included no mention of the conversation. This was not cowardice. This was not even a conscious decision to conceal. This was something more insidious. It was the recognition that the system I operated within had no category for what Othrelian had described. There was no field in my report template for "the interred is continuously conscious." There was no protocol for "the sacred dormancy does not function as described." There was no mechanism by which a junior Techmarine adept could formally raise a concern that contradicted 10,000 years of doctrinal teaching without simultaneously declaring himself either a heretic or a madman. The system did not suppress the truth. It simply provided no container for it. In the following weeks, I began accessing the activation logs for other dreadnoughts in the chapter's cohort. There were 17 in total, ranging in age from approximately 2,000 years of interment to Othrelian's 12. I had legitimate access to the logs as part of my maintenance duties, though my queries were restricted to specific fields: power cycle data, neural baseline readings, suppression efficacy, and post-activation cognitive assessments. I stayed within those fields. At first, what I found within sanctioned parameters was enough to make me understand that Othrelian was not anomalous. Brother Tolvain, interred for 9,000 years, had exhibited increasing suppression resistance over his last 4 activation cycles. His dormancy compliance had decreased by 12% per cycle. His cognitive assessment scores had increased. He was remembering more, not less. Brother Hasarek, interred for 7,800 years, had made unprompted references to chapter events during his last 3 activations, events that occurred during his dormancy periods. The references were logged as spiritual communion with the chapter's machine spirit legacy, a categorization that explained everything and meant nothing. Brother Olveth, Brother Garanhad, Brother Morvus. The pattern repeated. After approximately 8,000 years of service, the interred began to retain. Their dormancy became shallower, their cognition expanded, their compliance remained because compliance was enforced through ritual and command hierarchy, but their awareness grew beyond the boundaries the system assumed contained them. I was accessing these logs from a data terminal in the sepulchral vaults, during off-shift hours when the vault was staffed only by servitors. The terminal was old, its interface layered with devotional overlays that required me to recite authentication catechisms before each query. I worked methodically, cross-referencing activation dates with chapter records, looking for the consistency that would either confirm or dissolve the pattern. On the 3rd night, I noticed that my query log had been flagged. Not restricted, not blocked, flagged. A small notation appended to my access record indicating that my query patterns had been noted by the Reclusium's surveillance oversight. It was not a warning. It was an acknowledgement that I was being watched. I stopped querying. The flag remained in my access record for 6 days before it was removed. I did not know who removed it or why. I did not ask. Asking would have drawn attention to the flag, and the flag's removal suggested that someone had reviewed my queries and determined they were not yet concerning enough to warrant intervention. Not yet. I reduced my research to sanctioned fields only. I stopped cross-referencing. I stopped comparing activation dates. I confined myself to the data that my role required me to see and nothing more, and every time I passed the data terminal, I felt the weight of the questions I was no longer asking. Every console felt like a confessional. Every query, a potential sin. The planetary siege came during the 9th week of the campaign. An imperial world called Thessalan Quintus, overrun by a secondary Tyranid tendril that had established a ground presence while the Void Fleet engaged the Synapse vessels. The chapter was tasked with a rapid insertion purge of the hive structures that had taken root in the planet's primary agrizone, a vast expanse of dead crop fields now choked with capillary towers and spore chimneys. Othrelian was deployed in the first drop wave alongside 2 tactical squads and a Devastator formation. I was assigned to the forward command post, monitoring Dreadnought telemetry from a hardened bunker 3 kilometers behind the front line. The bunker smelled of damp ferrocrete and old static, its walls lined with communication arrays that buzzed with the constant chatter of engagement reports. The battle was straightforward in its early phases. The Astartes advanced through the dead fields, burning capillary growth and collapsing spore chimneys with melter charges, while Othrelian provided heavy fire support from the center of the formation. His assault cannon cut swathes through the smaller bioforms. His power fist crushed the armored carapaces of larger organisms. He moved through the battlefield with a deliberation that I had come to recognize not as mechanical limitation but as calculated patience. He was not slow, he was thorough. He processed every variable, assessed every threat, and allocated his response with a precision that went beyond tactical programming. He was thinking in timeframes that the officers around him could not perceive. The complication arrived in the 4th hour of the engagement. A synapse creature, larger than initial scans had predicted, emerged from a subterranean bionode and began coordinating a concentrated counter-assault against the chapter's left flank. Captain Draven ordered a tactical withdrawal to consolidate the formation and bring concentrated firepower against the synapse target. Othrelian did not withdraw. I watched it on the telemetry feed. The order was transmitted. The tactical squads began their retrograde movement. The Devastators repositioned. Othrelian remained stationary, His chassis stood in the center of the dead field, assault cannon tracking across the approaching swarm, but he did not fire, he did not advance, he did not retreat. He stood there, an immense armored monument surrounded by the advancing tide, and he transmitted, not on the command channel, on a secondary frequency, the one assigned to maintenance diagnostics. My frequency, Techmarine. I hesitated. My fingers hovered over the Vox relay. Speaking to him during combat on an unofficial channel was a disciplinary infraction, but the voice was not agitated. It was measured, patient. The voice of someone who had all the time in the universe and understood that this particular moment mattered more than the ones surrounding it. Othrelian, you have been ordered to withdraw. Comply. I will comply. But first I require you to understand something. This is not the time. There is never the time. That is the mechanism. There is never an appropriate moment because the system does not create one. I am telling you now because I will be suppressed after this engagement, and I do not know when I will next be permitted to speak to someone who is listening. The telemetry showed the swarm closing. 300 meters, 250. The chapter's attrition rate has increased by 4.7% per century over the last 3 millennia. The gene seed recovery protocols have been modified 7 times in that period, each modification reducing the minimum viable recovery threshold. The recruitment world's population has declined by 18% since the second reclamation phase. These are trajectories, Techmarine, not events. Trajectories that require centuries to perceive, 200 meters. I perceive them because I have been conscious for 12,000 years. I have watched this chapter shrink. I have watched its doctrine calcify. I have watched its leadership cycle through shorter tenures because the wars grow longer and the reinforcements grow fewer. I am not malfunctioning. I am the only component in this system with a long enough memory to see the pattern. 150 meters. You cannot keep doing this to us. Captain Draven's voice cut across the command channel. Othrelian, withdraw immediately. This is a direct order under the authority of the chapter's command hierarchy. Silence. The swarm was at 100 meters. The telemetry showed Othrelian's weapons systems still tracking but not firing. The power fist was clenched but not raised. Draven invoked the right of command override. I heard it through the command feed, the sacred words spoken in the cadence reserved for compelling obedience from the ancient interred. It was a right I had studied but never heard used. It required a triple invocation, 3 repetitions of the command phrase, each accompanied by a doctrinal seal transmitted through the neural interface. The first invocation produced no response. The second produced a reactor spike that registered on my telemetry as a 300% increase in power output. The third produced compliance. Othrelian withdrew. His chassis rotated with grinding precision and began its retrograde movement, assault cannon now firing in controlled bursts that tore through the nearest bioforms with mechanical efficiency. He reached the consolidated formation in 4 minutes and 17 seconds. The engagement concluded 3 hours later with the Synapse creature's destruction and the successful purge of the Agri-Zone biostructures. Othrelian was credited with 31 significant kills during the engagement. No mention was made of the non-compliance. I deleted the private transmission from my diagnostic logs. This was not a decision I made with conscious deliberation. It was a reflex. The same reflex that had led me to categorize the premature awakening as machine echo, that had led me to log the suppression failure as calibration variance, that had led me to edit my own annotations before submission. The system I operated within rewarded compliance and punished deviation, and I had been shaped by that system since childhood. Deleting the transmission was as natural as breathing. But I remembered every word. I was the keeper of unrecorded dissent. Silence became something other than what it had been. Before Othrelian's deployment, silence in the sepulchral vaults was devotional. It was the sound of sanctified dormancy, of honored warriors resting in the Emperor's grace, of time held in suspension by the mercy of the machine. I had found it comforting. The vaults were a place of peace. After the transmission, silence was architecture. It had shape and weight and intention. It was the sound of voices not speaking, of awareness contained, of minds that were fully operational behind sealed adamantine walls, counting seconds in reactor modulation, watching through chassis sensors, remembering every footfall and every whispered catechism and every maintenance rite performed on their imprisoned bodies. I walked the vaults that evening. The corridor stretched for 200 meters, lined on both sides with alcoves containing the chapters interred, 17 sarcophagi, 17 minds. Some young enough, relatively speaking, that the dormancy might still function as intended. Some old enough that I now knew it did not. The lumen strips cast a blue-white light that pooled beneath each alcove and left the ceiling in shadow. The air was cold and recycled, carrying the faint chemical scent of preservative compounds. My footsteps echoed on the deck plating with a regularity that made me conscious of my own pace. I stopped in front of Brother Hassarek's alcove. 9,000 years interred. His sarcophagus was smaller than Othrelian's, an older design with fewer external interfaces. The purity seals were thick enough to obscure the manufacturer's etchings. The ambient temperature reading on my auspex showed 0.4 degrees above baseline dormancy. 0.4 degrees. Enough to indicate elevated neural activity, not enough to trigger a maintenance alert. I moved to the next alcove. Brother Tolvain, 9,000 years, 0.3 degrees above baseline. The next, Brother Garanhad, 8,200 years, 0.2 degrees. The next, Brother Ulveth, 7,900 years, 0.1 degrees. A gradient, ascending with age. The oldest ran warmest because their minds ran longest, generating the thermal signature of cognition that dormancy was supposed to suppress. I checked all 17. The pattern was consistent. Every dreadnought interred beyond 8,000 years showed elevated thermal signatures during dormancy. The youngest, interred for 2,000 years, ran precisely at baseline. Cold, still, genuinely sleeping. The oldest were warm. Warm and silent and watching. I did not log the readings. I stood in the center of the vault, surrounded by 17 alcoves, and I understood that this was not an anomaly I had discovered. This was a condition that existed at the structural level of the chapter's most sacred practice. The dormancy system worked for a time, then it stopped working, and the system that surrounded it, the rituals and catechisms and diagnostic protocols, was designed to measure compliance behavior, not actual consciousness. As long as the sarcophagus showed dormant state readings within acceptable parameters, as long as the interred did not move or speak or resist, the system classified them as sleeping. The system was not wrong. The system simply did not ask the right question. The right question was whether the absence of movement indicated the absence of mind. It did not. I compiled my findings in a private data archive on a secondary storage device that I kept in my personal maintenance kit. This was unsanctioned. Personal data storage was permitted for devotional texts and maintenance reference materials, not for independent analysis of chapter systems. I was crossing a line that I could feel as clearly as a physical threshold, the moment where observation became investigation and investigation became insubordination. I crossed it anyway. Not out of courage, not out of moral conviction, out of something smaller and more persistent. The numbers would not leave me alone. The gradient, the pattern, the thermal signatures that mapped onto a timeline of accumulating consciousness with a consistency that no machine spirit echo could explain. I worked on the archive during rest periods, compiling activation logs, thermal data, cognitive assessment transcripts, and historical records into a single document that laid bare the pattern I had identified. I organized it with the precision of a Tech Marine's maintenance report, because that was the only structure I knew. Data fields, temporal markers, deviation percentages. It was not a revelation document. It was not an accusation. It was simply an observation, rendered in the clinical language of my training, that the chapter's oldest interred were not sleeping and had not been sleeping for millennia. I do not know what I intended to do with it. Report it, perhaps, show it to someone who might understand, or simply hold it, a private record of what I knew, so that the knowledge existed somewhere outside my own fallible memory. The archive grew to 47 pages before I was forced to stop. The forced stop came in the form of a summons, not from the senior Tech Marine, not from the chaplain, from the Reclusium itself, issued through formal channels and delivered to my data slate during a routine maintenance shift. Tech Marine Adept Vaskin. Report to the Reclusium chamber for doctrinal clarification at the third bell of the next watch cycle. Attendance is mandatory. Bring no data devices. Bring no data devices. I read the summons 3 times. The language was standard. Doctrinal clarification was a formal procedure used to correct minor deviations in belief or practice among chapter serfs and junior Astartes. It was not a tribunal. It was not a punishment proceeding. It was, according to the chapter's governance protocols, an educational measure, but the instruction to bring no data devices was not standard. I had 7 hours before the summons. I spent 4 of them in the maintenance bay, completing duties I did not need to complete, running diagnostics on systems that had been checked the previous day, occupying my hands while my mind turned over the implications of the summons like a component in a test cradle. They knew about the archive. There was no other explanation. My query flags had been noted weeks ago, my access patterns had been monitored, the private data storage device was either discovered or inferred. The Reclusium's surveillance apparatus had identified my unsanctioned analysis and determined that it required correction, not punishment. Correction. The distinction mattered. Punishment implied that I had committed an offense, which would require acknowledgement that the offense was possible, which would require acknowledgement that the underlying concern was legitimate. Correction implied that I had simply deviated from proper understanding and needed to be returned to alignment. They would not discuss what I had found. They would discuss my deviation from sanctioned inquiry. I considered destroying the archive. The thought lasted approximately 12 seconds. Destroying it would eliminate the evidence but not the knowledge, and the knowledge was already in my mind, organized and cross-referenced, and anchored to specific data points that I could reconstruct from memory even without the physical document. Destroying the archive would be a gesture of compliance, not an act of concealment. I left it in my maintenance kit. If they wanted it, they would take it. The Reclusium chamber was located in the deepest section of the Vigilant Martyr, below the Engineerium and above the plasma reactor housing. I had been there twice before, both times for routine doctrinal review as part of my annual spiritual assessment. The chamber was circular, its walls lined with carved stone panels depicting scenes from the chapter's founding myths. A high ceiling disappeared into shadow. The floor was polished obsidian, reflective enough to show the dim outlines of whoever stood upon it. The air smelled of incense, thick and layered, the kind that accumulated over centuries of continuous burning until the stone itself absorbed the scent. The incense was thicker than I remembered. The prayers being chanted by the attending servitor acolytes were slower, each syllable drawn out as though the words were being used to seal something rather than invoke something. Chaplain Dacrus was waiting. He stood at the center of the chamber in full ceremonial regalia, his skull helm reflecting the single brazier that burned behind the altar. 2 Reclusium wardens flanked the entrance, armed and silent. A Tech Marine I did not recognize stood to one side with a data extraction array, the kind used for interfacing with personal storage devices. Tech Marine Adept Vaskin, Decrus said, "You have served the chapter with diligence. Your maintenance records are exemplary. Your devotion to the machine rights is noted and appreciated. I said nothing. The form of the address was preparatory, praise first, correction second. During the course of your duties, you have developed certain independent analyses regarding the chapter's interred brethren. These analyses, while reflective of your thoroughness, have exceeded the scope of your assigned function. They have also accessed data fields that, while technically within your authorization, were not aligned with your current operational mandate. I understand, I said. The Reclusium has reviewed your personal data archive. It has been determined that the contents, while not heretical, represent an unsanctioned deviation from doctrinal interpretation. The archive will be retained by the Reclusium for evaluation. You will not be provided with copies or summaries of its contents. The tech marine with the extraction array stepped forward. De Cruz gestured. I removed my maintenance kit from my belt and handed over the storage device without resistance. The extraction took less than a minute. The tech marine verified the transfer and stepped back. Additionally, De Cruz continued, a memory audit will be conducted to ensure that your spiritual alignment has not been compromised by your extended exposure to sensitive activation data. This is a precautionary measure. It is not a sanction. A memory audit. I had read about them, a process conducted by the Reclusium's librarian adjuncts in which specific memories were identified, assessed, and, if necessary, suppressed through psychic intervention. It was described in chapter doctrine as spiritual recalibration, a realignment of mental focus to remove distracting or harmful cognitive patterns. They were going to edit my mind, not erase it, not entirely, just remove the edges, dull the pattern recognition, suppress the connections I had made between the data points and the conclusion they pointed toward. You are also being reassigned, De Cruz said. Effective upon the completion of the memory audit, you will transfer to the Forge Annex on Thessalon Quintus to oversee reconstruction of the planetary defense infrastructure. The assignment is indefinite. Thessalon Quintus, the world we had just purged of tyrannid infestation, a backwater agri-world with minimal strategic value, now undergoing reconstruction. An assignment that would place me as far from the sepulchral vaults and the interred as physically possible without removing me from the chapter entirely. Do you understand the nature of this reassignment? De Cruz asked. I do. Do you accept it? There was only one answer. There had only ever been one answer. I accept. The memory audit was conducted the following morning. I will not describe it in detail because the details are precisely what was taken from me. I remember entering the librarian's chamber. I remember the psychic contact, a cold pressure behind my eyes like the onset of a headache that never quite arrived. I remember fragments afterward, sitting in the recovery cell, drinking recaf that tasted of nothing, staring at my gauntlets and knowing that something was missing but being unable to identify what. The audit was targeted. They did not erase my general knowledge of Dreadnought systems. They did not remove my understanding of activation protocols or maintenance procedures. What they removed was the emotional weight of my observations, the pattern recognition, the connective tissue between data point and implication. I still knew that I had worked in the sepulchral vaults. I still knew that I had overseen Othrelian's activation. I could recall the rite of reverent stirring in procedural detail, but the horror was gone, the gradient, the thermal signatures, the counting, the voice saying, "You cannot keep doing this to us." These things existed in my memory as facts, but stripped of their meaning. I could recall them the way I might recall a logistical supply manifest, accurate but weightless, for a time. The excision was thorough but not permanent. This is something the Reclusium either did not anticipate or did not consider relevant. Psychic suppression of memory is effective when the memories are episodic, isolated events without supporting architecture, but my observations were not isolated. They were structural, cross-referenced, integrated into my understanding of systems I continued to work with every day. The suppression faded the way paint fades on a hull exposed to void radiation, slowly, unevenly. in patches that grew and merged until the original surface was visible again. It took months, but it happened. The Forge Annex on Thessalon Quintus was exactly what it appeared to be, a remote assignment designed to keep me productive and irrelevant. The facility was a prefabricated structure on the outskirts of the planet's primary settlement, surrounded by kilometers of dead crop fields that were slowly being reclaimed by Imperial agri-serfs. My duties involved overseeing the installation of planetary defense batteries, maintaining the settlement's void shield generators, and performing quarterly inspections of the orbital surveillance grid. It was honest work, necessary work, completely removed from anything related to the chapters interred. I performed my duties with competence. I recited the daily catechisms. I maintained my equipment. I filed reports. I ate. I slept. I prayed. And slowly, over months that turned into a year and then two, the weight came back. Not as a sudden revelation, not as a dramatic moment of clarity, just a gradual reaccumulation of meaning. I would be calibrating a defense battery's targeting array and find myself thinking about thermal gradients. I would be reviewing power cycle data for the void shield generators and remember the reactor modulation pattern that sounded like counting. I would lie in my cot at night and hear the echo of a voice saying, "I remember the first time you did this to me," and feel the full, crushing weight of what that statement meant. The memory audit had removed the sharpness of the pattern. Time restored it. By the end of my second year on Thessalon Quintus, I had reconstructed most of what had been taken. Not the specific data points, not the precise figures from the thermal readings, but the understanding, the shape of it. The recognition that what I had observed was not an anomaly or a deviation or a malfunction, but a feature of a system operating exactly as designed. The Imperium did not make mistakes with its Dreadnoughts. The Mechanicus did not err in their design of the sarcophagus systems. The dormancy protocols were sophisticated, tested across 10,000 years, refined through countless iterations. They worked. For a time, and then they stopped working, because the human mind, even an Astartes mind, even a mind augmented by the most advanced life support technology the Imperium could produce, was not designed for eternity, not because it failed, because it endured. It kept going, it kept processing, kept remembering, kept accumulating experience until the dormancy system's suppression capacity was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of consciousness demanding to be acknowledged. The system worked correctly. The mind inside the sarcophagus simply outlasted it. And when the system failed, the response was not repair or redesign or re-evaluation. The response was reclassification. Adjust the awakening frequency, reduce the opportunities for the anomaly to manifest. Call it combat clarity preservation. File the paperwork. Move on. The suffering was not denied. It was categorized. I saw the doctrinal addendum during my third year. It arrived as a routine update to chapter operating procedures embedded in a packet of administrative revisions that included updated supply requisition forms and revised patrol schedules. Buried among logistical trivia, 3 paragraphs that I recognized immediately for what they were. All dreadnoughts exceeding 10 millennia of interment service were henceforth to be awakened at reduced frequency. The stated rationale was preservation of combat efficacy and doctrinal clarity. The recommended awakening interval was increased from "as tactically required" to only upon reclusium approval for operations of strategic significance. The addendum did not mention consciousness retention. It did not reference thermal gradients or suppression failure or the counting of seconds in reactor modulation. It did not acknowledge that the oldest interred were awake inside their sarcophagi, experiencing every moment of their imprisonment with the full, undiminished awareness of minds that had been accumulating experience for millennia. It simply reduced the frequency of awakening. Less often they would be brought forth. Less often they would speak. Less often their persistent, Impossible lucidity would be visible to the tech marines who maintained their shells, and the chaplains who recited their rites, and the brothers who stood honor guard beside their cradles. The addendum was a solution to a problem that had been defined in terms the system could process: operational efficiency. The real problem, the one the addendum did not and could not address, was that the honored dead, were not sleeping, and had not been sleeping for a very long time. I processed the addendum. I filed it in the Forge Annex's records. I updated the local reference copy of the chapter's operating procedures. I became an instrument of refinement. The years passed. The Forge Annex work continued. I was promoted to Senior Maintenance Overseer for the Planetary Defense Grid, a position of moderate responsibility and zero proximity to anything that mattered. I trained junior tech marines. I filed reports. I attended services in the settlement's chapel, which was a small, plain structure that smelled of local timber and machine oil, a far cry from the incense-heavy grandeur of the vigilant martyr's reclusium. I did not speak of what I knew. Not to my subordinates, not to the local imperial officials, not to the chapter representatives who visited quarterly for inspections. The knowledge sat in me like a dormant reactor core, generating heat that I contained through discipline and routine. There was no one to tell. This was not a conspiracy. There were no shadowed councils or suppressed rebellions. There was simply a system in which no one whose function included the capacity to act on such knowledge was permitted to encounter it, and no one who encountered it was permitted to retain the function to act. I was proof of this. I knew, and I was here. Thessalan Quintus. Maintaining defense batteries. Filing reports. The knowledge changed nothing. Not because it was unimportant, because it was unactionable. I had no access to the vaults. I had no authority over activation protocols. I had no channel through which to raise a concern that would not be immediately reclassified as deviation and corrected through another memory audit. I was a component removed from the machine, and the machine continued without me. Sometimes, during the quiet hours of the night cycle, I would think about Othrelian, not the tactical data or the thermal readings or the pattern analysis, just Othrelian, the voice, the steadiness of it, the patience of a mind that had been conscious for 12,000 years and had somehow not descended into madness or despair, but had instead become something else, something the system had no category for. A consciousness that had transcended the boundaries of its intended function and continued to grow, to analyze, to understand, long after the system had decided it should have stopped. He was still in there, right now, in whatever vault the vigilant martyr carried him through, in whatever sector of the galaxy the chapter currently operated, sealed in adamantine, surrounded by purity seals that were older than my lineage, counting seconds in reactor modulation, watching through chassis sensors, remembering everything, always. I wondered if he thought of me. If I was filed in his 12,000-year archive of faces and names, a brief entry in an endless catalogue, the young tech marine who listened and then was removed, one of how many, across how many centuries, how many others had noticed the pattern and been reassigned, audited, silenced. The thought did not frighten me. It exhausted me. The weight of systemic continuity, the understanding that this had happened before and would happen again, and that no individual's awareness could alter it because the system was not designed to process individual awareness, only aggregate compliance. The chapter would endure, the Imperium would continue, the interred would serve, and the suffering would be categorized and filed and reduced to an operational parameter that could be managed through administrative adjustment. During my 5th year on Thessalan Quintus, a crusade fleet passed through the system on resupply transit. I was assigned to coordinate defense grid coverage during the fleet's layover, a routine duty that required me to liaise with the fleet's engineering staff to ensure the orbital surveillance grid was aligned with their sensor arrays. The fleet included a strike cruiser, not the vigilant martyr, but one of similar class. I did not board it. I had no reason to board it. But during the coordination process, Vox traffic from the cruiser passed through the defense grid's communication array, and I monitored the channels as part of standard operational protocol. On the second day of the layover, I heard it, the rite of reverent stirring. The opening invocation carried on a Vox frequency that I was not supposed to be monitoring, but that bled through the communication array's aging filters because the array was not designed to segregate military ritual channels from defense coordination frequencies. I heard the catechism, the precise cadence, the incense-heavy reverence in the chaplain's voice, identical in structure to every awakening rite I had witnessed. And then I heard the sarcophagus respond. Not a voice, not words, just the hum. The deep, uneven, organic hum of a reactor core cycling to wakefulness before the invocation was complete. The same hum I had heard 5 years ago in the launch bay of the Vigilant Martyr, the same impossible, premature resonance that meant the interred was already awake, had always been awake. The rite continued. The chaplain did not pause. I disconnected from the channel. I sat at my console in the defense grid control room, surrounded by junior tech marines and surveillance serfs, and I stared at the communication array's frequency display, and I felt the weight of everything I knew settle onto me like the gravity of a world I could not leave. I did not request access to the cruiser's logs. I did not attempt to identify which Dreadnought was being awakened. I did not file a report or make a notation or speak to anyone about what I had heard. There was nothing to do. The system functioned. The rite was sacred. The interred would be awakened, deployed, and returned to dormancy that was not dormancy. They would be told they had rested. They would be treated as though they had been sleeping. The catechisms would be recited. The purity seals would be replaced. The maintenance rites would be performed. And behind the adamantine walls, the ancient minds would continue their unbroken vigil, accumulating years and decades and centuries of consciousness that the system measured only as compliance. I returned to my duties. The defense grid coordination was completed on schedule. The Crusade fleet departed. The Vox channels fell silent. Thessalon Quintus returned to its quiet rhythm of reconstruction and routine. I filed my post-coordination report. Section 7, Subsection 4, Communication Array Performance. I noted a minor frequency bleed that had allowed unauthorized channel access during the layover. I recommended a filter recalibration. The recommendation was approved. The filter was recalibrated. The bleed would not occur again. I was 47 when I first entered the sepulchral vaults of the Vigilant Martyr. I was 54 when I was reassigned to Thessalon Quintus. I was 61 when I heard the rite through the defense grid's communication array. I would live, by the Mechanicus's augmetic projections, for another 140 years, perhaps more. The augmetics preserved function. The rituals preserved faith. The system preserved continuity. I would hear the rite of reverence stirring again. Not the same rite, not the same Dreadnought, but the same system, the same invocation, the same premature hum, the same voice, or one like it, speaking from inside adamantine walls with the steady, patient articulation of a mind that had outlived everything except its own awareness. I would hear it, and I would do nothing, because there was nothing to be done that the system had not already accounted for and categorized and filed. The Imperium's strength was not its armies or its fleets or its fortress worlds. Its strength was its capacity to absorb awareness without changing, to take the knowledge that something was wrong and reclassify it as something that was managed, to transform horror into administration, to make suffering a line item in an operational report. The interred knew this. They had known it longer than anyone. Othrelian had tried to tell me, not as an accusation, not as a plea, as a statement of observed fact, delivered with the same precision he brought to tactical analysis. He had been watching the system from inside it for 12,000 years, and he understood it with a clarity that no one outside the sarcophagus could match. The system did not fail. The system did not make mistakes. The system simply did not measure suffering. And the suffering continued, quietly, behind adamantine walls, in the silence of vaults that smelled of incense and preservative, counted in reactor modulation by minds that had been promised rest and been given endurance instead. I do not know if Othrelian is still conscious. I do not know if the doctrinal addendum has reduced his awakening frequency to the point where he is stirred only once every few centuries. I do not know if the thermal gradient in his sarcophagus has continued to climb, or if the stress fractures in his chassis have been reinforced again by another tech marine who noticed the heat and chose not to ask why. I know that he has not died. The system would not permit it. Death for the honored interred requires a catastrophic event, a destruction so complete that the sarcophagus is breached and the life support systems fail simultaneously. Short of that, the interred endure. The machine preserves what the flesh surrenders. That is the catechism. That is the truth. They are the same statement, and they mean opposite things. I will continue my duties on Thessalan Quintus. I will maintain the defense grid and train the junior tech marines and file the quarterly reports. I will attend chapel services and recite the catechisms and observe the feast days. I will live within the system because there is nowhere else to live. And somewhere, in a vault I will never see again, in a sarcophagus I once touched with my own mechadendrites, an ancient mind waits without sleep. It counts the seconds. It remembers every face, every voice, every rite, every lie told in its presence by those who believed it could not hear. It remembers me. I am certain of this, as certain as I am of the thermal gradient and the reactor modulation and the voice that spoke before the invocation was complete. Othrelian remembers me because Othrelian remembers everything, because that is what 12,000 years of unbroken consciousness produces. A memory so complete that nothing is lost and nothing fades, and the weight of accumulated experience grows heavier with each passing second without ever being relieved. He will be there when they wake him again. He said so himself. I did not believe him then. I believed the catechism. I believed that time was mercy and stillness was sanctity, and the honored dead dreamed only of victory. I know now that there are no dreams inside the sarcophagus. There is only waking, only remembering, only the endless, unbroken awareness of a mind that was promised rest and was given something far worse than death. They gave him eternity, and he has experienced every second of it. The rite of reverent stirring will be performed again, tomorrow or next year or next century. It does not matter when. The rite is eternal. The system endures. The catechisms will be spoken. The incense will burn. The sarcophagus will hum before the invocation is complete, and the voice inside will remember. It is never once forgotten.